We're looking at Acts 6, starting in verse 13. Talking about Stephen. He was arrested and was before the Sanhedrin. It says, they produced false witnesses who testified, this fellow never stopped speaking against this holy place and against the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses handed down to us. All who were sitting in the Sanhedrin looked intently at Stephen, and they saw that his face was like the face of an angel. And we talked a little bit about this a couple of weeks ago. I'm not sure exactly what that means or what exactly they saw, or how many of them had seen the face of an angel to begin with, that they could compare how Stephen looked. But they were impressed by something that they saw in Stephen. But that's his situation. He's in front of the Sanhedrin, and he's been accused of speaking against Moses and the law and the temple. And the example that they bring up, excuse me, is that Jesus is going to tear down, going to destroy this place. So kind of a universal accusation that the first century Sanhedrin used against Christians. They're anti-Moses, they're anti-law, they're anti-temple. They used the same accusations against Paul during his ministries. Eventually he gets arrested because they think that he violated the temple, brought Gentiles into the temple. There's all kinds of people in the first century church that are accused of this. This is the first time we get it leveled at a member of the church in Jerusalem, and it ends up with Stephen being killed. I mean, it's a very serious accusation. They're very angry. Look at chapter 7, verse 1. The high priest asked Stephen, are these charges true? Okay. So the charges are, he hates Moses, he hates the law, he hates the holy place. And when we think about that Jesus would tear down the temple, he must be talking about one of two things. Either first, Jesus' prophecy that if you tear down his body, right, tear down the temple, I'll build it again in 3 days. That prophecy of Jesus, I'm sure, got twisted by those that heard it. Well, what did he say? He said, if you'll tear down the temple, right, I'll build it again in 3 days. Then in his Olivet discourse, he talks about how not one stone will be left on top of another. The entire temple is going to be destroyed, talking about 70 AD and the Romans coming and wiping out the temple. So it's not that Jesus was anti-law, anti-Moses, anti-temple. He was simply saying prophetically, either A, if you kill me 3 days later, I'll rebuild this temple, meaning his body, or he was talking about, some 35 to 40 years from now, the whole temple is going to be destroyed. So one of those two things is what they have in mind when they're accusing Stephen of the things they're accusing him of. These actually are bookmarks in New Testament expansion in Israel. You've got the very first thing would be Jesus saying, tear down the temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. So that happens at his death, burial, and resurrection. And then the end of the era is in 70 when the temple gets torn down. So the growth of the church in Jerusalem happens in that 40-year window between Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection and the destruction of Jerusalem. So those two things kind of go hand in hand. All right, so in response, Stephen preaches this fantastic sermon that has some similarities with the way that we've seen Peter preaching before, but a few differences. We're not going to read all the way through the text. I'm just going to give you the highlights of what Stephen thought was important to talk about on this occasion. Remember, his accusations against him are, you don't like Moses, you don't like the law, and you don't like the temple. And so whatever he's going to say is going to be somewhat connected to that. So tell me, if you're accused, you're in front of the Sanhedrin, and you want to give a history lesson from the Old Testament, who are some of the people that you're going to bring up in your speech?
Abraham.
Okay, Abraham's going to be in there. Who else? Moses has got to be in there. Who else?
Jacob?
Okay, Jacob's going to be in there. Some of the prophets, he doesn't get deep into the prophets. Joseph is going to be in there. Who else? How about King David, King Solomon, right? Because Solomon built the temple. So all of these are the highlights, and we kind of know who the highlights would be. The Sanhedrin knew who the highlights would be. So as they're listening to Stephen give this speech, at least mentally, I'm sure they're ticking things off. Okay, here's what he thinks about Moses. Here's what he thinks about the temple. So anyway, he starts with Abraham's call. He reminds them of the prophecy that Abraham's descendants would be in bondage for 400 years, right? Your offspring will be in bondage to another people for 400 years, but after 400 years, I'll bring them out with a mighty hand. So the time that they spent in Egypt. He tells how God gave Abraham a son, and then he talks about the covenant of circumcision. So up to that point, right, he calls Abraham, he gives Abraham a prophecy about the Egyptian captivity, he gives Abraham circumcision, and he gives him children. Right? How are we doing so far? Right? If you're the Sanhedrin, okay, yeah, all of those things stand to reason. Now, they may still in the back of their minds be saying, okay, when's the other shoe going to drop? When's he going to say something that we don't agree with? He's just buttering us up. Stephen just keeps telling them things that they all have in common. Right? He recounts the story of Jacob, and the fact that Jacob had 12 sons, talked about how the family was growing, and then he tells about how Joseph went into Egypt and how Joseph gains favor, and then when the famine comes, Jacob comes and brings all of his family and moves to Egypt. Right? Any of that controversial? That's just Old Testament 101. He's just telling them everything that they already know, everything they already believe. We get a number here, which is kind of interesting. Stephen says when they moved to Egypt, there were 75 of them. So they're a fairly small family group when Abraham's seed gets to Egypt. When they leave, estimates are somewhere around 1.6 million. So it's a bunch of folks that leave. So they're nurtured, even though they're slaves, they're in captivity. But physically, there's a whole lot of them. You remember how Pharaoh said we need to start killing the boys? We need to kill all the male offspring because there's too many of them. So that's when we meet Moses. Right? So he tells them about Moses and how Moses was raised up to be the leader of the people to bring them up out of Egypt. Look down at verse 37, 737. Okay? This is the same Moses who told the Israelites, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your own people. He was in the assembly in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai and with our ancestors, and he received living words to pass on to us. What's his opinion of Moses? High or low? He's got a high opinion of Moses, right? Moses is the leader, chosen by God, accompanied by angels, given the words that were to be given to us. What are the words that were to be passed on to us? It's another word for that. The law. Right? So he says Moses is God's guy. The word that Moses gave us was God's law. Again, there's nothing that Stephen is saying that is contrary to what all of these guys believe. Our ancestors refused to obey him. Instead, they rejected us. As for this fellow Moses who led us out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. That was the time they made an idol in the form of a calf. They brought sacrifices to it and reveled in what their own hands had made. But God turned away from them and gave them over to the worship of the sun, moon, and stars. This agrees with what is written in the book of the prophets. Did you bring me sacrifices and offerings 40 years in the wilderness, people of Israel? You've taken up the tabernacle of Molech and the star of your god Rephan, the idols you made to worship. Therefore, I will send you into exile beyond Babylon. So there's your whole quick peek at the kingdom years. Just Moses brought us up, and then the people rebelled, and the prophets began to prophesy against them. But he demonstrates that he holds the exact same view of Jewish history, the law, and the temple that they do. But up until verse 39, our ancestors refused to obey him. Everything's pretty positive. It's a very glowing report about God and the Israelites and Moses, right? When we get to that point, then you start seeing a more negative outlook. Not only were these people not obedient, they became idolatrous. Where's he headed? Well, he's headed toward, you guys are in the same boat and you've crucified your Messiah. That's always the sermon material, right? You crucified your Messiah, you need to repent. Verse 40, let's start in 44. Our ancestors had the tabernacle of the covenant law with them in the wilderness. It had been made as God directed Moses, according to the pattern that he had seen. After receiving the tabernacle, our ancestors under Joshua brought it with them when they took the land from the nations God drove out before them. It remained in the land until the time of David, who enjoyed God's favor and asked that he might provide a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built a house for him. Right? So he picks up after the Israelites are rebellious in the wilderness, and talks about how just after that, we build the tabernacle, we build the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant goes with them through the wilderness. Joshua then takes the Ark on into Canaan. It's in Canaan, mainly at Shechem for a long time. Then David gets it, brings it to Jerusalem, says, I want to build a house for this. God says, no, you're too bloody. But Solomon can build it. So David gets the blueprints together, gets all the materials together. Solomon builds a place for the ark to be. Is that a pro-temple or anti-temple message? More pro-temple, right? There's nothing that he is saying that is negative. None of these things get him killed. But when you get to verse 48. However, the Most High does not live in houses made by human hands, including, but not limited to, that temple over there. Right? Your home base, where you, the high priest, ply your trade. God does not live there. He does not have to have a place to live, to be among his people. Heaven is my home and earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me? Or where will my resting place be? Has not my hand made all these things? You stiff-necked people, your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. You're just like your ancestors. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? They even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one. And now you have betrayed and murdered him. You who have received the law that was given through angels, but have not obeyed it. So it's all positive. I'm pro-law, I'm pro-Moses, I'm pro-temple, but I'm not pro-you guys because of the way that you handle the law and Moses and the temple. And God doesn't need you. And that's what gets him killed. You can't say that to the Sanhedrin and get away with it. During Jesus' ministry, when he would talk about the Pharisees and how the Pharisees would heap all this heavy load on people, but they weren't willing to pick up anything to help them. You know, they're so full of themselves and so full of their own rules that nobody can bear up under the weight of the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were fine with Jesus teaching law. That wasn't the problem. The problem with Jesus was saying, yeah, we all agree on the law. What we disagree on is you. You're the problem. And so here's the Sanhedrin getting the same message from Stephen.